You ever notice how you carry pieces of people who were never gentle with you? How their phrases slip into your mouth, their habits show up in your hands, and their shadows move through your decisions long after they've forgotten your name. It's strange, isn't it, how pain teaches us more about imitation than love ever could. You spend your life trying to unlearn the ways you were shaped, only to realize that the shaping happened long before you had a choice. And so you move through the world with this quiet ache, this subtle confusion, wondering why your instincts don't feel like your own, why your reactions feel rehearsed, why certain tones make you freeze, or why certain patterns pull you back into versions of yourself you thought you'd outgrown. You tell yourself that you choose your behaviors, that you've grown past the people who hurt you, that you're not influenced anymore, but somewhere deep inside, in the places that don't speak aloud, the imprint remains. And maybe that's the real mystery. Not why people hurt us, but why we become echoes of the very forces that wounded us. Why their voices blend with our internal monologue. Why their fears become our boundaries. Why their anger becomes our instinctive response. Why their emotional distance becomes our normal. Albert Bandura once suggested something uncomfortable yet liberating, that we are shaped by observation, not intention, that we learn who to be long before we know we are learning, that the people around us write on us in a language we don't understand until adulthood. So let me ask you this gently. How much of what you call yourself is actually borrowed? And how much of what you repeat was never truly yours? If that question makes your chest tighten, if it stirs something old inside you, then stay here with me for a while. Because this story isn't about blame or resentment. It's about recognition. And recognition is the first quiet step toward freedom. Because once you see the invisible strings, you're no longer just a puppet in someone else's play. And once you realize that you've been copying patterns you never chose, you finally become capable of choosing differently. But before we talk about freedom, we have to talk about illusion. The everyday, ordinary illusion you walk through without even knowing it's there. You wake up in the morning thinking you're starting fresh, but you're already carrying yesterday's echoes. You enter the kitchen and greet your family or your roommates or the silence. And even in those first few seconds, you're replaying emotional patterns you didn't consciously choose. Notice how you apologize too quickly, or how you stay quiet when you want to speak, or how your tone shifts, softens, sharpens, depending on who's in the room. Most people think they're acting from the present moment, but in reality, they're acting from old emotional scripts handed down to them by the people who once had power over their world. You walk into work or school or whatever space demands your presence, and again, notice the subtle ways you shrink or stretch depending on who's looking. Some people make you sit a little straighter, not out of confidence, but out of old fear. Some people make you talk too much, as if you're trying to earn the connection you should already have. Some people make you quiet, not because you're reserved, but because the energy reminds you of someone who once taught you that silence was safer. And the strange part is this: hardly anyone realizes they're doing it. They call it personality. They call it just how I am. But most of it, truly most of it, is conditioning disguised as identity. Bandura explained this simply but profoundly. We learn by watching, not just consciously, but subconsciously, emotionally, automatically. If a child watches someone lash out whenever they're afraid, they don't learn courage. They learn fear disguised as anger. If a child watches love shown only through sacrifice, they don't learn affection. They learn self-erasure as a form of belonging. And if a child watches someone survive by suppressing their truth, they learn that authenticity is a luxury they cannot afford. You might think you've escaped all of that, but look closer. Look at how you walk into a room and immediately scan it for emotional temperature. Look at how you anticipate reactions before they even happen. Look at how you adjust yourself, not to be authentic, but to avoid old wounds reopening. These patterns are so deeply woven into everyday life that you don't even call them patterns anymore. You call them normal. You call them being considerate. You call them keeping the peace. But what if it's not peace? What if it's just survival, disguised as kindness? And here's the illusion. You think you're acting freely, yet so much of your behaviour is borrowed, copied, inherited, passed down by people who are also copying the ones who hurt them. Pain travels through generations, not because it wants to, but because no one stops long enough to notice they're repeating what once wounded them. You live inside the illusion without realizing the walls were built by someone else's hands. You carry the emotional blueprint of people who never learned to heal. And you repeat them, not because you want to, but because your nervous system believes it must. But there comes a moment, a sharp, quiet moment, when the illusion cracks and you begin to see. And when that moment arrives, when something in you pauses, hesitates, questions, you feel a brief but unmistakable shift. It can happen anywhere. Maybe you're in the middle of a conversation and you suddenly hear yourself using a tone that isn't yours. Maybe you catch yourself apologizing when you've done nothing wrong, shrinking to make someone else more comfortable. Maybe you feel a rush of anger that disappears as quickly as it came, and you wonder, where did that come from? Who taught me to feel this way? These tiny ruptures are not accidents. They're glimpses of the machinery behind your identity. They're moments when the unconscious becomes visible, and suddenly you're no longer just reacting. You're watching yourself react. You're observing your own observation. And that's the beginning of awakening, because the illusion begins to dissolve, not with a dramatic moment, but with subtle recognition. You start to notice how your nervous system anticipates emotions that aren't even present. You start to see how your responses are built from old memories, old lessons, old wounds. You notice how you reach for comfort in the same ways the people who hurt you reached for control. You watch how you mirror expressions, body language, sarcasm, avoidance, self-protection, all inherited from places you don't visit anymore, but still carry inside you. And the strangest part is how normal it feels, how automatic it is. Bandura warned us about this. We imitate what we repeatedly see, even when we don't want to. The human mind is a sponge, not a filter. It absorbs long before it chooses. And so you grow up believing you are original, unaware that the blueprint was drawn before you had any say in the matter. But awakening begins the moment you dare to look at the blueprint instead of just living inside it. The moment you stop saying, "This is just who I am," and begin asking, "Who taught me to be this way?" You begin to realize that your personality might not be your personality. It might just be your adaptation. And when that realization hits, it doesn't feel empowering at first. It feels destabilizing, disorienting, even frightening. Because if the parts of you that you thought were you were actually shaped by someone else, then who are you beneath all that? Who would you be without the behaviors borrowed from the people who hurt you? That question marks the end of the illusion and the beginning of awakening. Awakening is rarely loud. It doesn't arrive like thunder or revelation. Instead, it slips into your life quietly, on a random afternoon, during an ordinary moment, while you're washing dishes or walking home or staring at a message you don't know how to respond to. Suddenly, you see yourself from the outside, as if watching a stranger wear your face. You catch your reflection, not in a mirror, but in your own behavior. You see the hesitation that isn't yours. You see the fear disguised as politeness. You see the anger that belongs to someone else but surfaces through you. And when that awareness floods you, it feels like someone opened a door inside your chest, letting in a cold gust of air. Your breath catches, your thoughts tangle. Something aches, not like pain but like truth, pressing against the surface, begging to be acknowledged. And for the first time, perhaps in your entire life, you see the pattern clearly, not as stories, not as memories, but as currents still shaping your present. You see how you learned to raise your voice from someone who believed control was the only way to be heard. You see how you learned to swallow your needs from someone who punished you for expressing them. You see how you learned to doubt yourself from someone who doubted everything. You see how you learned to ignore your emotions from someone who never understood their own. The weight of that recognition hits hard, because it forces you to confront the possibility that you are not broken. You are conditioned. You realize that the behaviors you've spent years blaming yourself for were not born from weakness, but from survival. And that survival was learned by watching the very people who should have protected you. Awakening is not peaceful. It's unsettling, raw, destabilizing. You feel grief not for what happened, but for who you might have been if you had grown up in gentler hands. You feel anger, not at yourself, but at the invisible inheritance passed down to you without consent. And you feel fear, because once you see the truth, you can no longer pretend. You can no longer hide behind the illusion of, "That's just how I am." Awareness is a doorway, and once you walk through it, there is no return. But awakening also carries a strange, delicate beauty, because hidden within that discomfort is an emerging sense of possibility, the first whisper that you might not be condemned to repeat the patterns that shaped you. And this whisper becomes the beginning of transformation. But before anything transforms, something must break. And that breaking often leads to isolation. Awareness separates you from the world in a way that feels both powerful and unbearably lonely. Once you start noticing the patterns in yourself, you begin noticing them in others too. You see the way people perform emotions they don't feel. You see how conversations are built on hidden insecurities. You see how conflicts are just unhealed wounds wearing adult clothes. You see how people pretend they're choosing their behaviors while blindly repeating the habits of their parents, their exes, their past. And you stand there in the middle of it, awake in a room full of people sleepwalking. It's isolating, not because you want distance, but because awareness creates it. Imagine this scene: a dinner table, laughter, small talk, routine stories. Everyone looks relaxed, connected, present. But you notice the undertones, the tightness in someone's smile, the defensiveness in someone's joke, the tension in someone's silence. You see the invisible strings behind their behaviors, the fears they're hiding, the narratives they're repeating, the wounds they're protecting. And suddenly, you're not just at the table, you're observing the table. You're not just participating, you're witnessing. And once you witness, you no longer belong in the same way. Because what used to feel familiar now feels scripted. What used to feel comforting now feels performative. And what used to feel normal now feels painfully transparent. You start noticing how people avoid the truth out of habit, how they change the subject when emotions get too close, how they cling to opinions they don't fully believe just to protect the identity they've built. You watch the defenses rise in their body language, the subtle shifts in tone, the practiced responses meant to keep vulnerability at bay. And you don't judge them. How could you? You used to be the same. You used to confuse avoidance with peace, silence with strength, detachment with maturity. But once awareness enters your life, it rearranges everything. You see the emotional choreography in real time, and it makes you feel like an outsider in your own story. There's a strange ache that comes with this clarity. You want to reach out, tell people what you see, help them understand the patterns they're repeating. But you also know that most people don't want to see themselves so clearly. Truth, for many, is not a mirror. It's a threat. And so you stay quiet. You listen. You observe. You carry the weight of seeing too much. And that weight becomes a kind of isolation no one warns you about. Yet the deepest part of this isolation happens internally. You begin distancing yourself from your own old habits, the way you used to appease, the way you used to justify, the way you used to minimize your needs. These behaviors no longer feel comfortable, but neither does the unknown path of becoming someone new. You're suspended, caught between who you were conditioned to be and who you're trying to become. And in that in-between space, you feel profoundly alone. Not because no one cares, but because no one can walk this part of the journey for you. Awareness demands solitude. It demands stillness. It demands that you sit with truths that cannot be softened. And so, like many people who awaken, you withdraw, not out of bitterness, but out of necessity. You step back from noise, from surface-level conversations, from people who pull you into old patterns. You begin choosing silence over performance, presence over pretending. And while this distance protects you, it also deepens the feeling that you've stepped outside the world you once belonged to. But isolation is not the final stage. It is only the valley you must walk through before you face the conflict that every awakened person eventually meets. The conflict between what you see and what you should do about it. Awareness is not passive. It doesn't simply show you the truth. It challenges you to decide what to do with it. That's where the conflict begins. Once you can see people's patterns, once you can see your own, the question becomes almost unbearable. Should you speak or should you stay silent? There's a quiet battle inside you between compassion and exhaustion, between responsibility and self-preservation, between wanting to help and wanting to walk away. You start noticing moments where you understand someone's behavior more clearly than they do. You see the fear behind their anger. You see the insecurity behind their arrogance. You see the pain beneath their detachment. And knowing all of this creates a moral tension, because part of you wants to reach out, soften their defensive walls, help them understand why they keep choosing the same pain over and over. But the other part of you knows the truth. People rarely change because someone explains their wounds to them. They change because their wounds finally become too heavy to carry. So you hesitate. You feel the urge to speak rising in your chest, then dissolving into silence. You fear that intervening might push them further into denial, while staying quiet might leave them drowning in the same patterns that once hurt you. And the conflict isn't just with others, it's with yourself. You feel the tension between old conditioning and new awareness. You want to respond with patience, but your old wounds react first. You want to set boundaries, but guilt echoes louder. You want to stay calm, but the emotions you inherited from the people who hurt you still know the shortcut to your throat. You feel like two versions of yourself arguing for control, the one who learned from the past and the one who was shaped by it. And in that struggle, something inside you begins to fracture, because awareness doesn't just illuminate, it exposes. And once exposed, your internal contradictions collide. You're torn between the desire to become your highest self and the reflexes inherited from the lowest moments of the people you once feared. This is the quiet war inside every awakened person. A war with no clear enemy, no clear answer, no clear victory. And eventually, the pressure becomes too much. Something gives way. Something collapses. Collapse doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like exhaustion so deep you can't find the energy to care. Sometimes it looks like confusion, like you're drowning in emotions that don't feel like they belong to you. Sometimes it looks like burning out quietly, privately, behind a calm face that fools everyone but yourself. Collapse is what happens when the mind finally admits it cannot carry both the awakened truth and the inherited conditioning at the same time. It feels like being pulled in opposite directions, one part of you stretching toward growth, the other dragging you back into familiar patterns. You feel frayed, emotionally overexposed, worn thin by the weight of understanding too much and changing too fast. And the metaphors become real. Your thoughts scatter like papers in a storm. Your emotions pool like water leaking through cracks you didn't know you had. Your identity feels like a house with the lights flickering. room by room. Collapse is not failure. It is the body and mind surrendering under the pressure of transformation. It is the emotional overload of seeing too clearly, feeling too deeply, understanding too quickly. And it leaves you standing in the ruins of who you used to be, unsure of what comes next. But here's the part no one tells you. Collapse is often the turning point, the moment when everything that's been tightening inside you finally loosens. When you reach the edge of yourself, when you can no longer pretend, when your mind finally breaks open under the strain of holding two identities at once, something unexpected begins to happen. You stop running. You stop over-explaining. You stop fighting the person you used to be. You stop trying to save everyone else. You stop trying to fix what was never your responsibility. Collapse strips you. It removes the illusions you clung to for safety. It forces you into a stillness you didn't want, but desperately needed. And in that stillness, you begin to hear a voice you've ignored for years, your own. Not the conditioned voice, not the borrowed voice, not the inherited fears, but something quieter, deeper, older. Something that sounds like the person you could have been if no one had ever hurt you. The collapse makes space for that voice to be heard. For the first time, you aren't reacting based on old patterns. You're simply feeling. You're not apologizing. You're not performing. You're not imitating. You're not inheriting. You're simply existing. And that emptiness, that silence, becomes the soil from which transformation begins. Revelation never arrives as a single moment. It rises slowly, quietly, almost shyly, like the first light slipping into a dark room. And the first realization that comes is this: you don't have to repeat what shaped you. You don't have to carry someone else's pain as your identity. You don't have to honor the people who hurt you by becoming their reflection. Bandura's work finally becomes clear. You learn through observation, but you can also unlearn through awareness. You begin to see that boundaries are not walls. They're doors that you choose when and if to open. You understand that silence isn't always suppression. Sometimes it's wisdom choosing where energy should no longer flow. You realize that healing isn't about fixing yourself. It's about releasing identities that were never yours to begin with. And slowly, something inside you begins to breathe again. You start using your voice. Not loudly, not dramatically, but truthfully. You say no where you once said yes. You step back where you once stepped forward. You ask for clarity instead of assuming responsibility. You walk away from chaos instead of trying to calm it. You no longer confuse self-sacrifice with love. You no longer confuse emotional labor with loyalty. You no longer confuse imitation with connection. You begin choosing differently, not because you're forcing change, but because you finally see the difference between who you are and who you were conditioned to be. And with that awareness comes a profound softness. You no longer resent the people who hurt you, not because they deserve forgiveness, but because you finally understand that they too were imitating the versions of people who once hurt them. You see the chain of emotional inheritance stretching across generations, and you realize you are the one who gets to break it. Not through force, not through confrontation, not through guilt, but through consciousness. You break it by refusing to continue the pattern. You break it by meeting your own pain with compassion. You break it by becoming the version of yourself that would have saved your younger self. You break it by not becoming the people who hurt you. Revelation is not the end of the journey. It's the return of your power, the quiet reclaiming of your voice, the realization that awareness was never a curse. It was an invitation to step out of imitation and into intention, an invitation to live from choice instead of conditioning, an invitation to finally become the person you were meant to be. Integration is the moment you stop chasing healing and start living it. It's when awareness no longer feels heavy. It feels natural. It's when you no longer analyze every emotion. You simply notice it, honor it, and let it pass. It's when you no longer fear becoming the people who hurt you, because you've already chosen your path, and it bends in a completely different direction. Integration feels like peace, not because your life becomes perfect, but because your inner world finally stops fighting itself. You don't erase your past, you understand it. You don't hate your conditioning, you outgrow it. You don't fear your old patterns, you recognize them and choose differently. And slowly, life becomes lighter. You start surrounding yourself with people who feel like safety. You begin speaking in ways that feel like truth. You walk through the world without shrinking for anyone. You give without losing yourself. You love without abandoning yourself. You stay without trapping yourself. You leave without guilt. And one day, in a moment so ordinary you almost miss it, you realize something extraordinary. You no longer copy the people who hurt you. Their patterns no longer live in your nervous system. Their voices no longer echo in your mind. Their fears no longer dictate your choices. You've rewritten the script. You've redrawn the blueprint. You've become someone your younger self would be proud to call home. And in that final quiet moment, you return to the question where we began. How much of you is truly yours? Now finally, you can answer, more than before, and more every day. Integration is not perfection. It is ownership. It is choice. It is freedom. And it is the reminder that even if pain is inherited, healing can be chosen. You chose it. You're choosing it now. And you will continue choosing it until the person you become is not the echo of someone else's story, but the author of your own.